The bundle of 200 gray sticks lay across a young woman's arms, dry and leafless and no thicker than a broom handle. Along the split-rail fence, men in faded overalls and dusty caps hooked their boots on the bottom board and laughed as she waded into the flooded field. She pushed the first dead stick a foot deep into the black mud, and the standing brown water closed around her wrist. Her father turned on his heel and walked to his wagon without a single word. That evening, a man in spectacles pressed an official notice into her hand, warning that no plant on earth would root in a drowned spring bottom. She kept planting anyway, until her cold fingers went white, and the drizzle on her cheeks ran together with something warmer. Behind her, a black leather ledger waited on the porch steps, filled with 60 years of a dead woman's secrets. On the last day of that same year, every farmer who had laughed would return to this fence, hats in their hands, and beg to know how she had done it. Everyone laughed the morning. Adaline Vaughn walked into the drowned land with 200 dead sticks bundled against her chest and began pushing them, one by one, into 6 inches of standing brown water. They gathered along the split-rail fence the way men gather at a hanging, boots hooked on the bottom board, hats pushed back, faces cured to leather by 40 summers of Illinois sun. They laughed because she was 19 and slight, barely 5'2" in her grandmother's cut-down boots, with hands that had turned more book pages than furrows. They laughed because the sticks were plainly lifeless, gray, and leafless and thin as a broom handle, hauled down from an attic where they'd lain forgotten in oilcloth. 200 of them. 200 dead twigs shoved into the black muck of a field that had never in living memory grown anything but frogs and fever. Her own father turned on his heel and walked to his wagon without a word. The man from the State Agricultural Society wrote her a formal notice that afternoon, declaring that planting in flood conditions defied every principle known to modern husbandry. And still she planted, until her fingers went white and numb, until the drizzle on her cheeks ran together with something warmer, so that no one watching could have told the rain from the weeping. Months later, that same fence line would be crowded with the same men, and not one of them would be laughing. They would come with their hats in their hands, and their throats gone dry, begging a 19-year-old girl to tell them what she had done. But to understand how the whole of Calder County came to stand, humbled at the edge of a swamp, you have to go back to the cold, February morning, when the woman who left her those sticks was carried out of the farmhouse for the last time, and the ground was too frozen to bury her. So she waited in the church cellar until the thaw. Prudence Vaughn had lived 81 years on the flat black land where Cane Creek bent lazy through the bottoms before it emptied into the Blackwater 2 miles south. She had outlived a husband, a son's leaving, 3 droughts, and every neighbor who'd ever spoken ill of her, and there had been many. The wives of Calder County called her a witch behind their fans and their pie safes, because her garden bloomed when theirs shriveled, because she set her beans by the moon when the almanac swore otherwise, because she talked to her rose canes the way other women talk to their babies. The men tolerated her for 2 reasons only. Her blackberry preserves had taken the ribbon at the county fair 11 years running, and her late husband, Elias Vaughn, had come home from the war with a shattered hip and a chest of medals, and a dead war hero's widow was not a woman you crossed in the open. So they let her be strange. They let her keep her 40 acres of useless bottom, and they waited quietly for the day she would die and the good riverland would come free. That day arrived on the 14th of February, 1884. Adaline had not grown up on the farm, not truly. She had been a dreamy child, forever wandering off, with a sketchbook and a stub of pencil. While her grandmother tried to teach her the names of the herbs, Prudence would fold a girl's fingers around a seed and say the whole future of a life was sleeping in that hard little shell, and Adaline would nod and then draw the shape of the clouds instead. When she was 16, her father had sent her to board with a spinster cousin in Danforth so she might finish her schooling proper, and the plan, so far as Adaline had a plan, was to sit the examination for the normal school at Bloomington and become a teacher, and never once in her life depend on the mercy of weather. She had a good hand for figures and a better one for reading aloud, and the children at the district school where she sometimes filled in adored her. She was going to leave Calder County the way a bird leaves a flooded nest, without looking back at the water. Then the telegram came to the dry goods store, where she clerked 3 days a week, and everything she had drawn for herself smudged and ran like pencil in the rain. The farm came to her because there was no one else. Her father, Silas, had spent 20 years running from the very soil that had broken his father's back, and he wanted nothing to do with the bottomland, but to be shed of it. He worked at the grain warehouse by the Danforth Depot, weighing other men's harvests, drawing steady wages, keeping his hands clean and his sleeves buttoned. When the will was read in the lawyer's office above the harness shop, Silas had looked at his daughter across the table with the tired eyes of a man who has already lost an argument he hasn't yet begun. "Sell it," he told her, on the walk back to the wagon, his breath ghosting in the February cold. "Whatever Lyle Ashford will give, take it. Pay the note, put the rest toward the normal school, and let that ground drown in peace. There's nothing in that field but the graves of every hope your grandfather ever had." But the note was the trouble. Adaline learned that soon enough when the letter came from the Calder County Farmers Bank on paper thick as a shingle, requesting the pleasure of her attention regarding the outstanding obligations upon the Vaughn property. She sat at the kitchen table with the stove ticking cold beside her and read it 4 times before the fish stopped swimming. Back taxes. A mortgage her grandmother had somehow kept alive through 2 decades of widowhood, current to the very month she died, paid down from some source no one in the family could name. And now the whole of it come due, called in, with 60 days granted for settlement before the bank would move to satisfy the debt by sale. 60 days. She had counted the money in the tin behind the flour bin and the money owed her from the store, and the sum of it would not have covered a tenth. She was 19 years old, and she owned 40 acres of water and a house with a suede roof, and in 60 days, a man in a black coat would take even that. It was on the last afternoon of March, with the 60 days already bleeding away, that she climbed into the attic to make ready for the auctioneer. The bank had suggested, with the gentleness men use when they mean to strip you bare, that she catalog the household goods for valuation. She went up the narrow stairs with a broom and a stub of candle, meaning only to clear the decades of a strange woman's living so that strangers might weigh it. Instead, she found the bundle. It lay upon a cedar chest, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, and when she lifted it, a smell rose off it that stopped her cold. Rosemary and dust and something green underneath, some low sweet rot of old wood that was not unpleasant. The twine binding it was gray and powdered to the touch, so brittle it fell apart when she worked her thumb beneath it. Inside were the sticks, 200 of them by her later count, each near 2 feet long and thick as a strong woman's finger, the bark dry and dun-colored and altogether ordinary, sort of prunings any tidy gardener would have carried straight to the burn pile without a second glance. She very nearly did carry them there. Her arms were already full of the useless leavings of a useless field, and deadwood was deadwood. Then she saw the paper, tucked beneath the vanished twine, folded once and yellowed at the creases, and she recognized the spidery slant of her grandmother's hand. "Plant these in the mud when the creek rises," it said. "Trust the water." She sat down on the cedar chest with the sticks across her knees and the candle guttering, and she turned the paper over. On the back smaller, crowded into the corner as if the writer had run short of room or short of time, were the particulars. Soak 3 days in rainwater. Set them a foot deep in standing water in the full open sun. Then wait. That was all. No no explanation, no witch's incantation, only the flat instruction of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and had not thought it needed defending. But the sticks were not all the attic gave up that day. Wedged behind the cedar chest, where a broom handle knocked against it and drew her hand, she found a book. It was a ledger of the ordinary kind, bound in cracked black leather, the pages soft as cloth from handling, and across the front, in the same spidery hand, was written a single word: roses. She opened it expecting recipes for preserves or lists of prize ribbons. What she found instead were 60 years of a mind at work. The book was a diary of the land itself. Season by season, decade by decade, Prudence Vaughn had set down what she saw. Which corner of the garden drained first after a rain, and which held water for a week? Which trees the ice took in the hard winters, and which stood? Little pencil drawings crowded the margins. A leaf, a root, the bend of a creek, a cross-section of a stem laid open to show the pale ring of living wood beneath the bark. And more than once, in more than 1 year, in ink and pencil, and once in what looked like the juice of a crushed berry, same observation returned like a refrain. The willows along Cane Creek grow fastest, where the flooding is worst. The ground beneath an old willow is black and crumbling and sweet, where the clay around it stays gray and sour. The land is not asking for corn. I have stopped telling it what to want. Adaline read until the candle drowned in its own tallow, and then she read by the gray light from the gable window, and something turned over in her chest that she could not have named to save her life. It was not hope. Hope was too bright and too fragile a thing for what she felt. It was closer to the last coal in a banked fire, the stubborn orange heart of it that refuses the ash and says, "Low and certain try." The next morning she carried a galvanized wash tub to the rain barrel and filled it, and she laid the sticks in the water to drink. For 3 days they soaked while the March rain came down steady and cold, and each evening she went out to look at them, lying dark and heavy in the tub. And each evening she read another season of her grandmother's book. She began to understand that the note in the attic was not the whim of an old woman gone soft in the head. It was a conclusion. It was the last line of a proof 60 years in the writing, and Prudence had trusted her granddaughter, of all the fools in Calder County, to carry it out. On the fourth morning, the rain broke long enough to show a low pewter sky, and Adaline hitched nothing to nothing because June the mule had died in January in the same hard cold that took Prudence, and she carried the sticks down to the bottom by hand, 4 and 5 armloads across the sodden pasture. 40 acres her grandfather had bitterly named the drowned land lay before her exactly as the name promised. Cane Creek had jumped its banks a fortnight past, and the whole low field was a shallow sheet of brown water, black mud beneath, the standing water rising halfway up her borrowed boots when she waded out. It smelled of decay and cold iron, and underneath, faint but unmistakable, that same green weighting she had breathed off the bundle in the attic. She had no grid, no line, no measuring rope. She simply walked and set them, feeling for firmer footing with each step, sinking a stick a foot deep where the note commanded and moving on, 6 feet or so between them, her rows wandering because there was no way to lay a straight line across water. The mud took each stick with a soft sucking pull that felt absurdly like appetite, as if the ground were glad. She planted through the morning and into the afternoon, her back a slow-building ache, her fingers cramping around the cold, wet wood, until the light began to slide toward the tree line at the field's far edge, and the last stick stood among its 200 fellows. She waded back to the high ground and turned to look at what she had done. From that little distance, her heart failed her, because it looked like nothing at all. It looked like the aftermath of a flood, a scatter of debris left standing when the water fell, twigs and wrack poking up out of the shallows without pattern or purpose. It looked exactly like the work of a girl who had lost her senses. It looked, she thought, like a mistake so large it could be seen from the road. Her father saw it from the road that very evening. Silas came out from town after his shift, his good shoes sinking in the soft ground at the field's edge, and he stood there a long while in the failing light and said nothing at all, which was worse than shouting. When he finally spoke, his voice had been sanded down to something almost gentle, and the gentleness was the cruelest part. "What have you done, girl?" It was not a question. He was staring at the water, at the sticks, at the whole impossible ruin of it. "What in God's name have you done to yourself?" Grandmother left instructions. She had rehearsed steadiness and was surprised to find she owned it. She left me the sticks, and she left me the note. She said to plant them in the mud when the creek rose. So I did. Your grandmother. He rubbed a hand down his face, and the hand came away no less weary. Your grandmother was a good woman, Adaline. I'll not hear otherwise. But she had notions. Old country notions from her own grandmother. Superstition dressed up as knowing. That's dead wood standing in dead water. You put dead wood in a swamp, you don't get a crop. You get rot and a season lost. and a bank that reads it plain as print that the girl holding this land can't be trusted to hold it. Then it will rot, she answered, and the words came out level and clear across the darkening water. And I will have tried, which is more than sitting in that house, counting the days until a man in a black coat comes to carry it off piece by piece. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something she had never once seen there, worse than anger, worse than shame. She saw grief, not for the farm, for her. He had believed all his life in the warehouse scale and the button cuff and the wages that came whether it rained or not. And here stood his only child up to her ankles, in the very superstition he had crossed a county to escape, wearing the same stubborn tilt of the chin that his mother had worn to her grave. "You're just like her," he said at last, and it was not spoken as a kindness. Then he climbed to his wagon and drove back toward the lights of Danforth, and he did not come again for 3 weeks. Adaline stood in the dooryard, listening to the wheels fade, and the loneliness that came down on her then was the coldest thing she had felt all that cold spring. Colder than the mud, colder than the water, colder than the empty stall where June the mule had stood. Word of what she'd done ran through Calder County faster than the creek ran to the Blackwater. In a country of flat fields and open doors, a strange thing did not stay secret past the second morning. By week's end, the men at the co-op had their opinions, and the women at the Methodist quilting had theirs. And even the children she had once taught their letters carried the talk home from supper tables to the schoolyard. The Vaughn girl had planted a swamp full of toothpicks. The Vaughn girl had gone the way of the old woman, moon-mad, root-mad. There was a cruelty in it that pretended to be concern, the way a stone pretends to be a gift when it is thrown. Emmett Whitcomb came on a Tuesday. He drove out in a light buggy behind a bay gelding, and he stepped down at the fence in a town coat and a bowler, spectacles thick as the bottoms of preserve jars, carrying a leather case, and a manner of such settled certainty that he seemed to have brought the whole authority of the state along in the buggy with him. He was the traveling man for the Illinois State Agricultural Society, sent out from Springfield to advise the farmers of the district in the newest and most scientific methods, and he measured every acre he ever met against the bulletins he carried, and found most of them wanting. He introduced himself to Adaline with the brisk courtesy of a man who did not expect to be there long. "Miss Vaughn." He was already looking past her, out at the field, his mouth tightening. "I've had a report from the county that there's been an unusual planting on this property. I'm obliged to inspect it, if you'll permit me." He did not truly wait for her permission. He waded out into the standing water in a pair of rubber galoshes drawn over his town shoes, and he stooped over the nearest stick with a small brass magnifying glass held to his eye. And he was out there a long while, scraping at the bark with his thumbnail, bending a stick to test its give, holding a cut end up to the weak sun. When he came back to the high ground, his verdict was already written on his face, and he delivered it the way a doctor delivers news he has grown too practiced to soften. "These are willow cuttings. Salix alba, the white willow, or some old ornamental strain gone half wild. Set that aside." He wiped his hands on a pocket square that would never come clean. "The wood is desiccated through. I find no cambium activity whatsoever. None. Which is to say there is no living tissue left in these cuttings to strike a root. They are, in the plainest terms, dead wood. But even were they sound, Miss Vaughn, even were they green and freshly cut this morning, you have set them in the single worst medium in the county. This is heavy river clay, soured and airless, the water standing on it with no way to drain. Roots want air as much as they want water. Drown a cutting in dead water and you get no root. You get putrefaction." He let the word land. "I would give these a fortnight before the rot sets in past saving." She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. "My grandmother grew roses in this ground, Mr. Whitcomb. Roses that carried ribbons home from the state fair. Roses in a tended bed on high ground are one thing." He said it with the weary patience a man spends on a slow pupil. 40 acres of drowned bottom are another entirely. I'll be frank with you, because I think frankness is the greater kindness here. I mean to enter this in my report as an unsound planting, and I would strongly counsel you to pull these cuttings out before they turn. Standing rot in a flooded field can breed a fungus that travels the whole watershed. If you'll not do it for your own sake, do it for your neighbors downstream. That evening, a folded paper came by a boy on a pony, an official notice under the letterhead of the society, warning that the planting on the Vaughn bottomland constituted a hazard to the district and recommending in the strongest terms its immediate removal. Adaline read it standing in the dooryard, and then she folded it small and put it in the ledger with her grandmother's book, and she did not pull a single stick. She had begun to understand that every soul in the county who knew anything at all agreed with the man from Springfield, that the whole weight of learning and law and neighborly sense was piled against her, and that she had on her side nothing but a dead woman's note and 60 years of pencil marks and the last coal in a banked fire. She talked to the sticks. She did not care who heard, and there was no one to hear. In the long blue evenings, she waded out among them and told them about her grandmother, and about the man in the black coat, and about the way her father had turned his wagon toward town without looking back. She told them she had nothing else, that they were the whole of her fortune, and that if they had any intention of living, they had best be about it. She knew how it would have looked to Whitcomb, to her father, to any sane person in the county. It looked like the beginning of the same madness they had buried in February. She talked to them anyway. The rest of her days she spent keeping the house alive, because a house left to die dies fast. She patched the suede roof with tar paper and roofing pitch, balanced on the ladder in the wind with a bucket and a brush, tarring the seams while the clouds moved fast overhead. She painted the porch steps a bright cornflower blue that her grandmother had loved, using up the last of a can she found in the shed, because the blue steps were a small defiance against the gray of everything else. She had no money for anything past what the kitchen garden gave and what her nearest neighbor carried over. Hetty Marsh lived a half-mile up the section road, a widow with more than sense and a heart that had never learned to close, and she took to bringing Adaline eggs and a loaf twice a week in exchange for help wringing hens' necks and mending coop wire. Hetty never once asked about the sticks. She would look out at the flooded field with her lips pressed thin, and then she would look at the girl beside her, and she would change the subject to the price of laying mash, which was a mercy Adaline never forgot. Through the whole of April, the rain would not quit. The black water came up a second time and pushed the creek back over its banks, and the bottom field went from a shallow sheet to a genuine pond, the water rising until only the very crowns of the sticks broke the surface, like the mastheads of some small drowned fleet. Adaline walked the high edge of the field every morning, watching the brown water, counting the tips she could still see, fighting down the doubt that came up her throat each dusk when the light failed and a house creaked and settled around her like an old ship. Some nights she took out the ledger and read her grandmother's pencil hand until the words steadied her. The land is not asking for corn. She began to believe that whether the sticks lived or died, she would not have been wrong to try. It was a thin comfort. She held it the way a person in cold water holds a floating board, not because it will save them, but because it is there. May came, and the sky opened, and the water began at last to fall. Day by day, the drowned land came back up out of its little sea. The crowns of the sticks stood clear, then the length of them, then the mud itself, cracked already at the high edges where the strengthening sun had gotten at it. Adaline waded out the first dry morning and went from stick to stick, laying her fingers to each one, and her stomach dropped like a stone down a well. They were gray. They were bare. They were, so far as her eyes and her fingers could tell, exactly as dead as the day she'd shoved them under. No leaf, no swelling bud, no green anywhere in all that field of debris. She stood among 200 lifeless twigs, with the mud sucking at her boots, and felt the cold hand of certainty close around her throat. And for the first time since the attic, she let herself think the word, her father, and the man from Springfield had both been too kind to say aloud. Mad, she had been mad. She had put the last of her time and the whole of her hope into a swamp, and the swamp had given her back exactly what a swamp gives. The county had already moved along to fresher talk. The Larson boy had put his father's harrow into a fence and lamed a horse. The church roof wanted mending, and the ladies were raising the money by the slice. There was a wedding coming and a lawsuit brewing, and 100 small dramas riper than a Vaughn girl and her toothpicks, which had gone stale as last week's bread. So Adaline thought herself forgotten and was almost grateful for it, and was wrong. They came on the first Saturday in May, 3 men together, and she saw them from the porch and knew before they reached the fence that this was not neighbors come to gawk. Lyle Ashford led them, the banker, black-suited and smooth, with the mild, pleasant face of a man who has never once in his life had to raise his voice to take a thing away from someone. Beside him came Emmett Whitcomb, his leather case under his arm, his certainty restored after a fortnight of being right. And a step behind them both walked Rufus Thackeray. Everyone in Calder County knew Rufus Thackeray. He held more acres than any 3 men in the district. Good high river land bought up cheap over 30 years from widows and failures and the newly dead, and he had wanted the Vaughn bottom for the better part of a decade, not because it was worth anything, but because it lay between 2 parcels he already held, an untidy gap in an otherwise clean map of his ambitions. He was broad through the shoulders and easy in his walk, and he smiled a great deal, and his smile had put more farms in his ledger than any deed ever had. Adaline came down off the porch and out to meet them barefoot, her overalls stiff with dried clay, her hair tied back with a length of baling twine, and she knew as she crossed the yard that she looked like precisely the thing they had come expecting, a foolish girl playing at a man's work in a field of her own ruin. Miss Vaughn. Ashford's voice was oil-poured warm. I understand congratulations are in order. Word is you've made improvements to the property. Improvements. Thackeray turned the word over and laughed, a big man's laugh that rolled out easy across the field. Is that the word we're using? I heard she'd planted a forest of matchsticks down here in the wet. Her grandmother's turning in the churchyard. Girl, God rest her. She may have been strange, but she was never a simpleton. My grandmother planted these. Adaline held her voice low and steady, which cost her more than they could know. I only finished what she started. Whitcomb had already stopped listening. He had waded out to the nearest stick with his magnifying glass and his air of a man returning to the scene of an easy prophecy, and he crouched over it, thumbnail to the bark, spectacles glinting. As I told Miss Vaughn a fortnight past, he announced over his shoulder to the 2 men on the bank, loud enough to carry, there is no cambium activity. The cuttings have taken up too much water and drowned outright. You can see the darkening here at the base, precisely as I predicted, the first stage of the rot. Another week and these will be so much mush in the mud. Which bring us, Ashford said, unbuckling a leather portfolio with the unhurried grace of a man who has done this 100 times, to the plain arithmetic of your situation, Miss Vaughn. The note remains, the taxes remain, and the 60 days grow short. The bank is prepared to be generous. Not what the ground might fetch as sound farmland. You understand, given the condition of the house and the, shall we say, experimental use to which the field's been put, but fair. More than fair considering. He drew out a paper and held it toward her across the fence rail. I think you'll find our offer a mercy. She did not take the paper. She did not even look at it. She was looking past all 3 of them at the stick. Whitcomb still crouched over, because something had caught her eye down at the base of it, at the waterline where the gray bark met the black mud, and she was suddenly, wildly unsure whether she saw it or only wished it. There was a swelling, a small pale bulge in the bark, no bigger than a grain of wheat. And from beneath it, finer than a thread, finer than a hair, a single white filament reached down and lost itself in the mud. Mr. Whitcomb. Her voice had gone strange in her own ears. There's a root. He did not look up. Miss Vaughn, I've explained to you the impossibility of there's a root. Look at it. Look. Something in her tone reached him. He bent lower, brought the glass down close, and for the space of 3 heartbeats he did not move at all. Then he shifted to the next stick, the one past that, and Adaline watched the certainty drain out of the man's face the way water drains out of a field, slow at first and then all at once, leaving something naked and shaken behind it. That's not, he stopped. His thumbnail found another node, an inch up the gray bark of the 3rd stick, where the wood should have been dry and dead through. He froze again. That is not possible. Not in these conditions. The want of air alone should have, but the roots were there. She could see them now that she knew to look, on stick after stick, threads of white breaking from the base and vanishing into the mud, dozens of them, scores of them, on near half the field. And on 3 of the sticks nearest her, at nodes she would have sworn a week ago were dry as kindling, there was something that stopped her heart clean, and then started it again at a gallop. Green, not a leaf, not yet, nothing so bold as a leaf. Only the faintest swelling of a bud, the barest breath of color come up in the gray, like the first whisper of dawn, at the black bottom edge of the sky. Thackeray, up on the bank, could see none of it. Rot, he said, comfortable and loud. The girls looking at rot and calling it roots. I've watched 1,000 cuttings go bad. They grow a white mold, looks just like a root to a soft eye that wants to see one. It's nothing. Whitcomb straightened up out of the water. His face had gone the color of tallow. His magnifying glass hung forgotten from his fingers, and his leather case had slipped and taken on mud at the corner, and he did not so much as glance at it. When he spoke, it was very quiet, almost to himself, and Thackeray on the bank did not catch it at all. "They're rooting," he said. "God help me. They're actually rooting." "What was that?" Thackeray's smile thinned. "Nothing." Whitcomb came wading back toward the fence too fast, splashing, and there was something new in his voice that Adaline had never expected to hear from a man like him, something that sounded very near to fear. "I need to make further observations. This is highly irregular. I can render no final report today." Ashford felt the ground shift under the 3 of them, though he could not have said how. He looked at Adaline then, truly looked at her for the first time, saw the mud caked to her knees and the fierce light standing in her eyes, and the way she held herself among her 200 sticks like a small barefoot general who has just watched her broken line refuse against every law of war to fall. He cleared his throat. He tucked the unsigned paper back into his portfolio and buckled strap. "We'll revisit this," he said, "when the season's further along. When there's more to see." They went. Thackeray was still chuckling as he climbed to the wagon seat, but the chuckle had gone hollow, a laugh with the bottom fallen out of it, and twice on the way up the lane he turned in his seat to look back at the field, at the girl standing motionless in the middle of it. Whitcomb looked back more than twice. He looked back until the buggy carried him around the bend and the willows and the girl, and the whole impossible green-flecked field slid out of his sight. And Adaline Vaughn stood alone in the drowned land with the mud closing warm around her ankles. And she reached down and laid one finger against the faint green swelling of a bud that 10 days ago had been dead wood in dead water, and she began at last to cry. Not out of grief. Grief she had learned by heart that spring. This was something with no name she knew, a thing too large for her chest. Terror and wonder, married so close she could not tell one from the other. The whole crushing weight of a possibility she had not permitted herself to believe in until the moment it broke green in her hand. The men from Springfield and the bank and the biggest farm in the county had come to bury her, and instead they had been over her ruined field and found it, against all their learning, alive. She did not yet understand a single reason for it. She did not know that a willow will strike from a bare cutting where almost nothing else on earth will, that it carries its own root-making within its wood, that it was built by 10,000 years of flooded riverbanks to do exactly the impossible thing it was doing. She knew only that her grandmother had been right, that the note had been true, that the water was to be trusted after all. She knelt in the mud among the first green buds of a thing no one had believed could live, and she wept until she had no weeping left. And then she wiped her face with a muddy hand and looked out across 200 sticks, turning slowly, secretly, into something the whole county would one day come begging to understand. The green did not stop at 3 buds. Within a week, the faint swellings along the gray bark had split open into narrow silver-backed leaves that caught the morning light like fish turning in shallow water. And by the middle of May, there was not a stick in the field that could honestly be called a stick any longer. They were saplings. They stood a foot high, then 18 inches, reaching for the sun with a hunger Adaline could nearly see, as though the wood were making up in a season all the years it had lain dead in the attic. She went down each dawn with the ledger under her arm and a length of knotted string, and she measured them the way her grandmother had measured her roses, marking the growth in pencil, and the pencil marks climbed the page faster than she could quite believe her own hand. But the saplings were not the wonder. The wonder was underfoot. She found it the first week of June, after a hard overnight rain that would ordinarily have put the whole bottom back under an inch of standing water. She waded out expecting the old brown sheet across the field and found instead only wet ground, dark and soft but drained, the water gone somewhere in the night. She crouched and pushed her fingers into the mud, where a sapling stood and the clay came up in her hand, changed. Where it had been a dense gray paste that held its shape like potter's stock, it now crumbled between her fingers, threaded through with fine dark fibers and pale hair-thin roots that spread outward from the base of the willow like the opening fingers of a buried hand. Air had gotten into it. Something had opened the ground that had been closed since before her grandfather cursed it, and she knelt there turning a handful of it over and over, not understanding the how of it, only the fact. Her grandmother's book understood. That night she read by lamplight the pages she had skimmed before, and found the pencil observations she had not known to weigh. Where the willow roots run, the hard clay breaks. The water that stood a week now stands a day. The ground learns to breathe. Prudence had watched it happen along Cane Creek over 60 years, one slow willow at a time, and had set it down without ever knowing the chemistry beneath it, the acids the roots gave off to loosen the clay bonds, the channels their growth punched through the airless muck, the fallen leaves feeding carbon back into ground that had been starved of it since the last forest was cleared. Adaline did not know the chemistry either. She knew only that her field was learning to breathe exactly as the old woman had promised it would, and that no bulletin from Springfield had ever contained the fact. Word came up the section road again, but the tone of it had shifted, and she felt the shift before she understood it. The wagons that had once slowed at her fence so their drivers could point and grin now slowed so their drivers could stare. Hetty Marsh brought her quilting circle out on a Sunday afternoon, 6 women in their good bonnets who stood at the fence with their fans going and their curiosity plain on their faces, watching the girl move among a line of green where they had all sworn nothing but frogs would ever live. One of them, a broad woman named Cora Ellery, who had called Prudence a witch to her face at more than one church supper, asked in a voice pitched to carry whether it was true. The girl talked to the trees, and Hetty answered before Adaline could, that a body might do worse than talk to something that listened, which shut Cora Ellery's mouth for the afternoon. Adaline let the success go to her head. She would come to see that later, and blame no one but herself. The saplings along the field's low edge, nearest where Cane Creek curled in and the water moved even in dry weather, were the tallest and the strongest, and it seemed to her a simple thing that more water meant more willow. So she took her grandmother's autumn instructions, though it was not autumn, and she cut fresh green whips from her strongest trees, and she carried 60 of them to the deepest, stillest part of the bottom, a low blind pocket at the field's inner corner where the flood always stood longest and drained last, a black glassy pool that never moved at all. She set them there a foot deep in the dead water, 60 green cuttings from her own thriving stock, and she went back to the house well pleased with herself, certain she had doubled her fortune in an afternoon. For 10 days she let herself believe it. Then a 3-day rain came down out of a low sky, and when it cleared she went to the inner corner to see her 60 and found them gone soft. The bark had darkened past the green stage into something wet and black, and when she closed her hand on the nearest one, it gave like a rotted rope, sloughing under her fingers, the inner wood gone to gray slime that smelled of the grave. Every one of the 60 had done it. Every single one. She stood over the dead pool with the ruin coming apart in her hand and felt the bottom drop out of her the way it had dropped. The morning she thought the whole field had failed, only worse now, because this time she had no one to blame but her own certainty. Whitcomb had been right after all. Not about the field, but about the water. Dead water drowned a cutting. She had proven it herself, on her own trees, out of her own pride. She went up to the house, and she opened her grandmother's book, and she read the note on the back of the original paper again. the note she had memorized in the attic, and then, in her hurry, half forgotten, set them a foot deep in standing water. Standing water, she had read it as still water, dead water, the deeper the better. But 3 pages into the ledger, in a passage she had passed over as poetry, Prudence had written what she meant. The willow wants wet feet and moving water. Set it where the creek breathes in and out, at the living edge, never in the dead pools where the flood forgets to leave. In the dead pools, even a willow will drown. The original planting had lived because Adaline, knowing nothing, had walked the whole open field and set the sticks where the flood sheeted across and drained toward the creek, in the moving skin of the water, exactly right by pure blind luck. The 60 had died because she had thought she knew better and set them in the one dead corner of the field where nothing that breathed could live. The failure sat on her worse than any of Whitcomb's warnings, because it was true and because she had earned it. She went out that evening and stood over the black pool with its 60 rotted whips, and something in her cracked that had held all through the mockery and the loneliness and her father's turned back. She had let herself believe she was chosen. She had let herself believe the field had spared her because she was special, when the plain truth was that a stubborn tree had done what a stubborn tree does, and she had happened to stand in the right place holding the bundle. The whole county thought her mad, and she had begun, in her pride, to think herself blessed, and both were wrong, and the wrongness of it opened under her like the dead pool itself. She did not sleep. Somewhere past midnight, she came down the stairs in her nightdress, with a lamp in one hand, and she took the axe from beside the woodbox, and she walked out into the dark field. The moon was down. The saplings stood in ranks, she could barely see, silver ghosts of themselves, and she went to the nearest one at the field's high edge, and set the lamp in the mud, and took the axe in both hands, meaning to cut the whole grove to the ground and burn it and be done, to stop being the mad Vaughn girl the county laughed at, to sell the ruined ground to Thackeray and take the train to Bloomington and become someone who had never stood weeping in a swamp. She raised the axe. The lamplight ran gold along the edge of it. Adaline. Her father's voice came out of the dark behind her, low and careful, the way a man speaks to a spooked animal, and she turned with the axe still lifted, and found Silas standing at the edge of the lamplight in his shirt sleeves, his good coat gone, his face older by years than it had been 3 weeks before at the fence. She had not heard the wagon. She would learn later that he had walked the last half-mile up the section road in the dark, unable to sleep himself, drawn back to the farm by something he could not have named, and had come up the lane to see his daughter standing over her own trees with an axe raised to the sky. Put it down. He did not come closer. He held out one open hand into the lamplight, slow. Whatever it is, girl, put the axe down and tell me. The whole of it came out of her at once. The 60 rotted cuttings, and the dead pool, and the note she had misread, and the pride that had misled her, the words tumbling out broken and fast, while the axe sank slowly in her grip. I thought I understood it. I thought the field spared me because I'd earned it, and I hadn't earned anything. I got lucky. I put the first ones in the right place by blind chance, and then I thought I was clever, and I killed 60 good trees in an afternoon. Whitcomb was right. Everyone was right. I'm exactly what they say I am. Her voice broke on the last of it. I'm just like her. And she died alone with the whole county calling her a witch. And that's where this ends, Pa. That's the only place it can end. Silas crossed the mud then, and he took the axe out of her hands, gently, the way you take a thing from a child who has hurt herself with it, and he set it down out of her reach in the wet grass. Then he did a thing he had not done since she was small. He put his arms around his daughter and held her while she shook, and over her shoulder he looked out at the dark field, at the grove of saplings standing silver in the last of the lamplight, and when he spoke, his voice was not the voice of the man who had turned his wagon toward town. Look at them. He turned her, one hand on her shoulder, to face the high edge of the field where the first 200 stood. Not the corner, not the ones you lost. Look at these. 3 weeks ago, I stood at that fence and called this dead wood in dead water, and I walked away from you, and I was as wrong as a man can be. 60 trees drowned in a bad spot doesn't make you your grandmother's madness, Adaline. It makes you a girl who tried something nobody ever tried, and got most of it right the first time and one part of it wrong the second. His hand tightened. That's not witchcraft. That's not luck either. Not anymore. That's learning. The difference between you and every fool who ever laughed at you is that when you got it wrong tonight, you read the book again instead of blaming the weather. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. You believe me now. I believe my eyes. He looked a long moment at the willows. I should have believed them 3 weeks ago, and I'll carry that. But I'm here now, and I'm not going back to town till this is settled one way or the other. He let go of her shoulder and bent and picked up the lamp, and the light swung up across the saplings. And for the first time since February, the drowned land looked to Adaline not like a grave, but like a beginning. Now come inside before you catch your death standing in a swamp in your nightclothes. The trees will keep till morning. They've kept this long. She did not cut the grove. In the morning, she went to the dead pool and pulled the 60 ruined whips and carried them to the burn pile. And she did not plant that corner again, because the field had taught her where it would and would not have her. Silas stayed. He took a week's leave from the warehouse he had never once in 20 years taken leave from, and he mended the barn door and rehung the pasture gate and dug a proper drainage cut at the field's high edge where Adaline showed him the water wanted to go. And in the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table and read his mother's rose book by lamplight with an expression Adaline could not read. A man meeting a woman he had spent his life misunderstanding, 20 years too late to tell her so. The willows climbed. By the third week of June, they stood taller than Adaline, their trunks thickening from broom handles to wrist-thick poles, their leaves a dense silver green that moved in the least wind with a sound like distant applause. Around the base of each tree a ring of green had come up in the bare mud, clover and plantain and low grasses that had not grown in the bottom in the memory of anyone living, drawn up out of ground that a willow had taught to breathe. The field that had been a sheet of brown water in April was, by the last week of June, something that had no name in Calder County, a young wet woodland where a swamp had been, loud with red-winged blackbirds that had not nested there before because there had been nothing to nest in. Rufus Thackeray came back the last day of June, and he came alone. He found Adaline at the field's edge with her string and her ledger, and he leaned on the top rail of the fence and watched her work for a while before he spoke, and there was none of the easy public laughter in him now. The men who had come with him in May were not there to perform for, and without an audience, Thackeray was a different creature, quieter and colder, the smile still in place, but gone flat behind the eyes. You've got something here. He said it like a man conceding a hand of cards he means to win anyway. I'll grant you that much, and I don't grant it easy. But you're a bright girl, so let's talk plain. The two of us, without Ashford and his portfolio and that fool from Springfield. He gestured out at the willows with his chin. Pretty. Real pretty. But pretty doesn't answer a mortgage. You can't haul Willow to the elevator and weigh it out for cash money. You can't feed a family on shade. And that note of yours comes due whether these sticks are green or gray. My father has no debts you need to concern yourself with, Mr. Thackeray. Adaline did not look up from her measuring. The mortgage is the bank's business and mine. Is it? Something moved under the flat of his smile. You sure your father's got no debts? You sure of that? Because I happen to know Silas Vaughn bought seed on credit from the Danforth Co-op 3 years back, the year he took a notion to try farming this very ground again before he lost his nerve. Bought seed, planted nothing, never paid it out. That debt's still on a book somewhere, girl. Debts don't die just because a man decides to forget them. He straightened off the rail. Ground like this, in a family carrying paper it can't cover, it has a way of coming loose. You do well to sell to a friend before it comes loose to a stranger. My offer stands. It won't stand forever, and it won't stand so high once these leaves turn brown in the fall and everyone remembers what this field really is. He touched his hat and walked back to his horse, and Adaline stood watching the dust of him go up the lane with a cold thread working its way through her chest, not because of the shade or the elevator, because of the certainty in him when he spoke of her father's debt, the specificity of it, the way he had known a 3-year-old transaction between Silas and the co-op down to the reason for it. That was not gossip. That was a man reading from a ledger he had studied. She asked her father that night, plainly, over the supper table, whether he had bought seed on credit 3 years past and left it unpaid. Silas set down his fork and was quiet a moment too long. I bought seed, he admitted. That much is true. $12 of it, meaning to put in a corn crop on the bottom before I came to my senses. I never planted it. I meant to pay it back, and then your grandmother took sick that first time, and the money went to the doctor, and I let it slide. And I'm ashamed to say I let it slide clean out of my mind. $12, Adaline. How does Rufus Thackeray know the particulars of $12 I owe the co-op? Neither of them had an answer that night, but Hetty Marsh had a piece of it 3 days later. She came across the pasture with a basket of eggs and a face full of something she plainly did not want to be carrying, and she set the basket on the porch step and would not sit. I've heard a thing, she began, twisting her apron, and I don't know that it's mine to say, only if it were my farm I'd want it said to me. My sister's boy clerks at the Farmers' Bank in Danforth, keeps the books, and he told me something at Sunday dinner that's set wrong in me ever since. She looked out at the Willows as if she could not meet the girl's eyes and say it. That mortgage on this place, Adaline. The one Lyle Ashford holds over you. The bank doesn't hold it, not truly. My nephew says it was bought up 2 years back, quiet, through the bank, but not by the bank, by a private party, and the bank only services it now, only collects. The paper belongs to somebody else. Adaline felt the cold thread pull tight. Who? Hetty's mouth worked. The name on the assignment, she said, is Rufus Thackeray. The whole shape of it turned over in Adaline's mind at once, like a field seen suddenly from a rise. Thackeray had not been circling her land waiting for the bank to fail her. Thackeray was the bank in every way that mattered. He held her mortgage in his own name, bought quiet through Ashford, so no one would connect the biggest farm in the county to the note choking the smallest. He had picked up her father's $12 seed debt from the co-op besides, and any other loose scrap of Vaughn paper he could find, gathering the family's obligations into one hand the way a man gathers reins. The 60 days had never been the bank's mercy running out. They had been Thackeray's noose drawing closed, timed to fall exactly when the flood would make the ground look worthless and the girl look mad, so that he might take the last untidy gap in his map for the price of the back taxes and call it a kindness. He had come to the fence in May to watch the bank foreclose on a swamp. He had gone away instead to watch in growing alarm the swamp turn green. That's why he came alone. Adaline said it slowly, the pieces settling. He didn't come to make an offer. He came to see how far along the trees were. He came to measure how much time he had left before the whole county sees this field the way I see it, and the ground he's been buying up cheap for 30 years stops looking cheap. Hetty's nephew, pressed gently over another Sunday dinner, gave up more. The private note carried a hard term buried in its language, a clause that Ashford had never read aloud in his oily recitations at the fence. If the taxes and the arrears were not settled in full by the deadline, the holder of the note might elect to take the land in satisfaction of the debt outright, without public auction, without the property ever being offered to another buyer. No sale to the highest bidder, no chance for Adaline to find a rival purchaser who might pay enough to clear the note and leave her something. Thackeray had written himself the sole door out of her trouble, and the door opened only onto his own barn. The generous offer he kept dangling was not generous at all. It was the only price she would ever be allowed, because when the deadline fell, he could simply take the farm, and the offer was merely a way to make her sign it over smiling and save him the paperwork. Silas took the news badly. He walked the length of the drainage cut he had dug, back and forth in the dusk, his hands opening and closing at his sides, and when he finally spoke, his voice shook with a shame that had teeth. This is on me, every foot of it. If I hadn't left that $12 sitting, if I'd been a man about my own debts, he'd never have had the thread to pull. He's been building this for 2 years while I weighed other men's corn and told myself I'd escaped farming clean. I didn't escape anything. I just left my mother and my daughter standing in the trap alone. He stopped and looked at the willows, gone gray-silver now in the failing light. How long? How long until the deadline? Adaline had counted it that afternoon, sitting on the blue porch steps with the bank's letter in her lap. The taxes and the arrears come due the last day of August, she said. 60 days from when the letter came, and near 40 of them already gone. She looked out at her trees, tall and thriving, and worth, so far as any man in Calder County could see, precisely nothing that would answer a mortgage. 2 months. We've got 2 months to turn a woodland into money. And there isn't a soul in this county who'd give us $1 for the whole of it. The rain, which had been the enemy all spring, chose that week to become the enemy in reverse. It simply stopped. Low pewter skies that had drowned the bottom through March and April gave way to a hard cloudless blue that stacked up day on day, and the sun came down on Calder County with a weight that turned the roads to powder and the puddles to cracked plates of dried mud. At first, the farmers were glad of it. The corn that had stood yellow-footed in the wet all spring greened up and shot skyward, and the co-op talk turned hopeful, and men who had cursed the flood in May blessed the sun in July. Then July wore on, and the sun did not relent, and the blue did not break, and the gladness curdled by slow degrees into unease. The topsoil crusted. The young corn, which had leapt up on the spring's stored water, began to reach its roots down into ground that had nothing left to give, and the deep green of the blades took on a grayish cast at the edges, a dullness. The first far-off signal of a thing no farmer likes to name. An old man named Josiah Pruitt, who was past 70 and had farmed the district since before the war, stopped his wagon at Adaline's fence one blistering afternoon, not to gawk at the willows but to rest his horse in what little shade her taller trees threw across the road. He sat there fanning himself with his hat and looking at the sky with the flat wariness of a man who has seen too many summers. Feels like the dry summer of '64, he said, to no one in particular, to the horse, to the air. Folks don't remember '64. Rain quit in June that year and didn't come back proper till near October. Creeks went to dust. I watched the Blackwater get so low a boy could walk it dry-shod at the ford. He put his hat back on and gathered the reins. Corn's looking proud right now. Corn always looks proud right before it doesn't. Clucked to the horse and rolled on, and Adaline stood at the fence and watched him go, and turned to look at her own trees, which did not have the grayish cast, which stood as deep and silver green in the drought's first weeks as they had in the wet. She understood why by the middle of July, when she went out with a spade meaning to find dust and found instead, under the canopy of her tallest willows, dark crumbling earth that closed cool and damp around the blade a foot down. The roots she had watched come up as white threads in May had thickened over the summer into a spreading underground net, and that net had gone down after the falling water table and found it, tapping old buried creek channels and the deep cool wet that the drought had lowered, but not emptied. Overhead, the same trees that drank so deep let fall a steady soft rain of small leaves and spent twigs that lay thick on the ground beneath them, a mulch that held the coolness in and the moisture down, so that around the foot of every willow a circle of stubborn green persisted, clover and violet and grass, while 40 feet away in the open the ground cracked and paled. The field was not merely surviving the drought, it was ignoring it. It had built itself a private weather. The county noticed that too, and this time no one drove slow to point and grin. The wagons that passed her fence now carried men with drawn faces who looked at the green line of her trees. The way a thirsty man looks at a well, he has been told, is poisoned, wanting and afraid to want. By the last week of July, the corn across the district had given up its proud green for good. The blades curled tight along their spines to save what water they had left, rolling into gray-green spears that rattled like dry paper in the hot wind. The soybeans yellowed from the edges in. The pastures browned and crisped and stopped growing, and men began hauling water to their stock in barrels from ponds that shrank a hand's width a day. The State Society's traveling man drove himself ragged from farm to farm with his leather case, and there was nothing in any bulletin he carried that could make it rain, and the certainty that had walked with him into Adaline's field in April did not ride with him now down the powdered roads of a county going to dust. Lyle Ashford's next letter came on the hottest day of the month, and it did not oil its words. The bank, it said, writing as ever on behalf of the noteholder, wished to remind Miss Vaughn that the arrears fell due on the 31st of August, that no extension would be entertained, and that the holder of the note remained willing, as a courtesy, to accept a conveyance of the property in full settlement, sparing Miss Vaughn the indignity of the deadline's harsher remedy. Attached again was the offer, the same figure, a sum that would clear the taxes and the $12 seed debt and leave just enough over for a train ticket and a terms board at the normal school, the price of a girl's whole future set at exactly what it cost to make her disappear. Thackeray came the same afternoon the letter arrived, and Adaline understood that he had timed it so, that he had wanted her reading the bank's cold paragraphs with the dust of his horse still hanging in the air. He did not dismount. He sat his horse at the fence in the beating sun and looked at her green field with an expression that had finally stopped pretending to be friendly, and what stood in its place was worse, a naked wanting, the face of a man watching a thing he had counted on owning grow more valuable in another's hands by the day. You've seen the letter. He did not phrase it as a question. Then you know how it stands. 31 days. And a field full of trees you still can't sell. He let his gaze travel the length of the willow line, and something in it curdled. Half this county's corn is already gone. By September, there'll be families in Danforth wondering how they'll get through the winter. And here you sit on the one green 40 acres in Calder County, and it can't buy you a sack of flour. Bitter joke in that somewhere. Sign the conveyance, girl. Take the money, take your train, go be a schoolmarm, and tell your pupils someday about the summer you grew a swamp. It's the best end you're going to get, and every day you wait, it gets worse. Not for me. For you. Adaline folded the bank's letter along its creases, slow, and slid it into the pocket of her apron, and when she looked up at him, the fear that had been working through her chest all month had burned off somewhere in the July heat and left something harder behind it. You bought my grandmother's note 2 years ago, she said, and watched the words land, watched his face go still. You bought my father's seed debt off the co-op. You had Ashford front, all of it, so no one would tie the biggest farm in the county to the smallest mortgage in it. You didn't come here in May to make me an offer. You came to make sure the trap you'd spent 2 years setting was going to close on schedule. And it isn't, is it? That's what's eating you alive out here in the sun. You set it all up to take a worthless swamp for the back taxes, and the swamp turned into the only living ground in the county while you watched, and now you have to sit there and want it, and you can't have it until the last day of August, and you are terrified of what these trees are going to be worth by then. For a moment, the mask came off entirely, and the man beneath it was not smiling at all. You don't have 31 days worth of cleverness, girl. You have a dead woman's book and a field of shade. When the deadline falls, I will take this ground, trees and all, and there is not a thing on God's earth you can do to stop it. He wheeled the horse hard, enjoy your green, while it lasts. He rode off into the shimmering heat, and Adaline stood at the fence with the bank's letter heavy in her apron pocket and 31 days in front of her, and behind her the willows moved in the hot wind with their sound like far-off applause, worth nothing that anyone in Calder County knew how to count, and worth, she was suddenly and fiercely certain, more than any of them yet understood. She turned her back on the dust of Rufus Thackeray and walked down into her trees, into the cool the willows had made where the whole rest of the county baked, and she began, with no idea yet how, to look for the way to turn shade into money before the last day of August took everything her grandmother had left her. The answer had been in the house the whole time, and Adaline found it because the drought drove her to it. With the deadline 4 weeks off and no notion of how a woodland became money, she went back to her grandmother's ledger and read it not for comfort now, but for a way out. Page by page, past the observations of soil and season, into the crowded back third of the book she had always skimmed as an old woman's bookkeeping. It was bookkeeping. That was the discovery. It was a record of trade. The entries ran back better than 20 years, kept in the same spidery pencil, and they were not about roses at all. Cut osier, October, 40 bundles. Delivered Springfield, and beside it a figure. Bark, stripped and dried, spring, 200 weight. Cane's shop, another figure. Charcoal, Willow, 6 cents. The forge at Danforth, another. Season by season. Year by year, Prudence Vaughn had been cutting selling the young growth off willows Adaline had never known existed. Willows that must have stood along the creek before some flood or some winter took them. And the sums in the margins were not large, but they were steady, and they added, across a year, to more than the mortgage payment. This was the source no one in the family could name, the money that had kept a widow's note current for 20 years through drought and hard winter. Not witchcraft, not luck. A crop, a quiet, patient, unglamorous crop that every man in Calder County had been too busy laughing to see. She sat with the book open on the kitchen table, long past the lamp wanted trimming, and the thing her grandmother had known came clear to her. At last the answer to the taunt Thackeray had thrown at her twice now like a stone. A willow was not shade. A willow was three trades standing in one tree. Long, straight, first-year whips, the osier, went to the basket weavers and the chair bottomers, who bought all a body could cut and always wanted more. The bark, stripped and dried, went to more than one buyer, and the ledger named them, a druggist's shop in Springfield among them, for there was something in willow bark that brought a fever down, and the apothecaries paid by the pound for it. Wood itself, burned slow in a covered pit, made a fine light charcoal that every blacksmith's forge in the county wanted. Prudence had sold all three off a handful of trees for 2 decades. Adaline had 200 of them coming into their strength in a summer when every other crop in Calder County was curling to dust. The names in the ledger were her map, and the first of them was a man called Merritt, a basket manufacturer in Springfield whose orders appeared year after year in her grandmother's hand. Adaline wrote to him that same night a plain letter stating who she was, whose granddaughter, and what she had, 200 willows coming to their first strong cutting, osier by the bundle, bark by the hundredweight, and asked whether the standing arrangement might continue. She walked the letter to the Danforth depot herself the next morning in the punishing heat and paid for it out of the tin behind the flour bin. And then there was nothing to do but wait, with the deadline burning down and everything riding on whether a man in Springfield still remembered a strange old woman's name. Her father did not wait idle. Silas took the wagon into Danforth and came back with a set of stripping knives and a draw knife and a froe for splitting, tools a willow man needed, bought on the last of his own credit at a hardware where his name still meant something. And when Adaline protested the cost, he set the tools on the porch and would not hear it. I sat on the bank of this field in May and called it a grave, he said, unrolling the knives from their oilcloth. The least a man can do, having been that wrong out loud, is buy the knives to prove it. I'm done being ashamed at a distance. If we're to cut a crop off this ground before the 31st, we cut it together. Took up a stripping knife and turned it in the light. An aging warehouseman learning a trade his own mother had mastered, and he had never once thought to ask her about, and the not asking sat on him plain, a grief he had earned and would carry. Merritt's answer came back inside the week, and it changed everything. He remembered Prudence Vaughn, remembered her osier as the best that came into his shop, remembered too that she had died, and assumed the source lost with her. He would take all the girl could cut at the old price and a little better, for the drought had put the pinch on cane and Reed's cellars up and down the state, and good willow was suddenly dear. He wanted first-year whips by the bundle delivered to the depot in Springfield, and he named a figure for the season's cutting that Adaline read 3 times standing on the blue porch steps, because the figure by itself was not the whole mortgage, but it was near half of it, and it was only the osier. The bark and the charcoal were yet to come. For the first time since the attic, she let herself do the sum all the way to the bottom of the column, and the bottom of the column said she could pay the note. If the cutting went well, if the buyers held, if nothing broke between now and the last day of August. Something broke 4 days later, and it was the drought that broke it, though not the way anyone wished. The county had passed from unease into genuine fear. The corn was gone past, saving across the whole district, the blades bleached and rattling, whole fields written off where a man could walk between the rows and hear his own passage in the dry hiss of dying leaves. Miller's Creek, which fed the Blackwater from the north, had stopped running entirely, and Cane Creek was down to a chain of shrinking pools in a bed of cracked mud, Though under Adaline's willows, the ground stayed dark and the roots still reached the deep wet no drought had yet found. Wells were failing. In Danforth, the talk had turned to how the town would water itself if the dry held into September, and out on the farms, men were driving stock miles to the few ponds that still held, and the ponds were going green and low. Hetty Marsh came across the brown pasture at a pace her age did not favor, and the fear was on her before she reached the porch. Her nephew at the bank had sent word, and the word was worse than the drought. Thackeray had moved. Seeing the Willows thrive, seeing the letters go to Springfield, understanding at last that the girl he had meant to starve out was about to cut a crop that would clear his note, he had gone to Ashford and demanded the Bank Act on a clause no one had troubled to read aloud, a provision that let the note holder call the debt in default at once if he judged the security of the property impaired or its value threatened by the borrower's use. He meant to argue that cutting the Willows, the very act that would raise the money, damaged the land that secured his note, and on that argument he would move to take the farm now, weeks before the deadline, before a single bundle of osier could reach Springfield. He can't. Adaline had the ledger against her chest without remembering picking it up. Cutting the whips doesn't harm the trees, it's how you keep them. They come back stronger. My grandmother cut them 20 years and the trees are still standing. He's not asking a judge whether it's true. Hetty's hands twisted the apron to a rope. He's asking Ashford to sign a paper saying it's true, and Ashford collects on that note for him and does what Rufus Thackeray tells him. My nephew heard them in the back room. There's a hearing set. The county judge, Harlan Pyle, holds a session in Danforth on the 9th to settle the paper, and if it goes the way Thackeray's paid for it to go, the sheriff puts you off this land before the month's half done. Trees and all. He takes the crop standing. She finally sank onto the porch step, spent. He's not waiting for the trap to close anymore, child. He's kicking it shut early because he's afraid you'll walk out of it. The 9th was 5 days off. Adaline stood on the porch with the heat pressing down and the brown pasture running away to the dust-colored horizon, and she understood that the fight had changed its shape entirely. It was no longer a race to cut and sell before the last of August. It was a hearing, a matter of paper and argument before a judge, and paper and argument were Thackeray's country, not hers. He had money for a lawyer and a banker in his pocket and 30 years of standing in the county, and she had a 19-year-old's word and a dead woman's book. The plain arithmetic of it, the arithmetic Ashford loved to recite, was all on his side. Then we don't fight it his way. Silas had come to the door behind her, the stripping knife still in his hand, and there was something in his voice that had not been there since before Adaline was born, the sound of a man who has decided to stop losing. He wants to stand up in front of Harlan Pyle and say cutting the Willows ruins the land. Let him. We'll bring the proof he's wrong and set it on the judge's table where the whole county can see it. He looked at the ledger against his daughter's chest. Your grandmother wrote down 20 years of cutting those trees and them coming back. That book isn't rose notes, girl. That book is testimony. And a dead woman who kept honest records for 20 years is a harder witness to argue with than any lawyer Rufus Thackeray can buy. They built the case the way they were building the crop, together at the kitchen table by lamplight while the drought pressed the house in silence. The ledger gave them the years of cutting and the buyers' names. Merritt's letter gave them a manufacturer's word that the standing arrangement had run for 2 decades on trees that still stood. And Adaline saw, reading the entries again with a lawyer's eye she did not know she owned, that her grandmother had recorded not just the sales, but the cuttings themselves, tree by tree in the early years, how a willow, coppiced hard in the fall, threw up a dozen strong new whips by summer, how the cutting did not kill the tree but drove it, how 20 years of harvest had left the creek willows thicker and more vigorous than a wild stand ever grew. It was set down plain in a dead woman's pencil, the exact opposite of the harm Thackeray meant to swear to. The willows were not damaged by cutting. They were made by it. There was a harder truth in the ledger, too, and Adaline found it 2 nights before the hearing, and it stopped her cold. Among the back entries, tucked between a bark sail and a note on the autumn coppicing, was a line in her grandmother's hand that was not bookkeeping at all. R. Thackeray came again about the bottom. Offered a fair price, he called it. I told him the land is not for sale while I can hold it, and I can hold it as long as the Willows sell. He does not know about the Willows. Let him keep on thinking it a swamp. The date was 11 years gone. Thackeray had been circling this ground not for a decade, but for twice that, and Prudence had held him off the whole time with a crop she had deliberately hidden from him, letting the whole county believe her a witch tending a worthless bog rather than let Rufus Thackeray learn that the drowned land paid. She had died before she could tell her granddaughter the secret plainly, and had left it instead where a girl with 60 days and no other hope might find it. Bundle in the attic had never been a whim. It had been a bequest and a battle plan and a trust. Adaline read that line aloud to her father across the lamplit table, and Silas set down his knife and was quiet a long time, and when he spoke, his voice had gone rough. She fought him 20 years and never told a soul, not even me, especially not me. She knew I'd have sold it to him the first hard winter just to be shed of the worry. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes. My whole life I thought she was a foolish, stubborn old woman holding on to a swamp out of spite. She was holding a fortress. She was holding it for you, girl, and she died before the relief could get here and left you the keys and the map and trusted you to hold the wall till you understood what you were standing on. He looked at the ledger as if it had become something holy. We are going to win this. Not for the farm, for her. Because that woman fought a 20-year siege alone and lost the ground to nobody. And I'll be damned if her own granddaughter loses it to Rufus Thackeray in a paper, hearing 5 days after the relief arrived. The morning of the 9th broke hot and white, the sun already cruel by 8 o'clock, and Adaline drove into Danforth beside her father with the ledger wrapped in clean oilcloth on her lap, and Merritt's letter folded inside her grandmother's Bible for safekeeping. The town was crowded past its custom, for a drought empties the fields and fills the town, and word of the hearing had run through the county the way word of her planting had run in the spring. Men who had laughed at the toothpick forest in April stood along the boardwalk in the shade of the awnings to see how it came out, and their faces were not laughing now, for a good many of them were carrying paper of their own. To men like Thackeray, and a hearing about whether a note holder could seize a working farm on a manufactured pretext was a hearing every mortgage man in Calder County had a stake in. The proceeding was held in the long upstairs room over the land office that served Danforth as a courtroom, and it was full to the walls, hot as a kiln, the windows thrown up for what little moving air the morning offered. Harlan Pyle sat at a plain table at the head of the room, a spare gray man of 60 with the unhurried eyes of a judge who had watched money try to dress itself as justice for 30 years and had stopped being impressed by the tailoring. Thackeray had brought a lawyer up from the county seat, a polished man named Coyle in a good coat, and Ashford sat beside them with his portfolio. And the three of them had the easy look of men who have counted the votes before the meeting. Adaline had no lawyer. She had her father and a book and a letter, and the plain truth, which she was about to learn, was not always enough by itself in a room where the other side had paid for the furniture. Coyle opened smooth and sure. He laid out the note, its terms, a clause that let the holder act to protect impaired security, and he painted the picture Thackeray had bought and paid for. A reckless girl, stripping a mortgaged property of its timber, hauling the very substance of the land off to Springfield by the wagon load, leaving the note holder's security gutted. He called the Willows a standing asset being carried away piecemeal. He made cutting sound like theft. He was good. And the room felt the weight of him, the practiced certainty, and Adaline saw more than one face that had come sympathetic go thoughtful, because a man in a good coat saying a thing plainly has a power that has nothing to do with whether the thing is true. Then Judge Pyle turned his unhurried eyes on Adaline and asked, without ceremony, what she had to say for herself, and she stood up with the ledger in her hands, and her heart going like a trapped bird. 19 years old in a room full of grown men who traded farms like cards, and for one long, terrible moment, nothing came. The heat pressed. A fly worked at the window. She felt every eye in the room settle on her and find her wanting a slip of a girl in her one good dress. and she understood that if she spoke like a frightened child, she would lose the farm in the next 5 minutes, no matter what the book said. She thought of her grandmother holding the wall alone for 20 years, and she opened the ledger. My grandmother kept this book for better than 20 years. Her voice came out steadier than she was. It isn't a diary. It's an account. Every fall, she cut the young growth off her willows and sold it, osier to the basket makers, bark to the druggists, charcoal to the forges, and she wrote down every cutting and every sale, tree by tree, year by year. Coyle says cutting the willow strips the land and ruins the security. My grandmother cut these same trees, or their fathers, for 20 years. She stepped forward and laid the open book on the judge's table, turned so he could read it, and here they still stand. A willow that's cut in the fall throws up a dozen new whips by summer. Cutting doesn't harm the tree. It's how you keep it. 20 years of it left the creek willows thicker than they ever grew wild. It's written here in her own hand, every season of it, and a manufacturer in Springfield will swear the same because he bought the crop for 20 years and thought the source died with her. She set Merritt's letter beside the book. Mr. Thackeray isn't trying to protect the value of that land. He's trying to take it before I can prove the land has any value at all, because the day I cut a crop off it and pay the note, he loses a thing he's been trying to buy for 20 years, and he knows it, because my grandmother turned him down 11 years ago and wrote that down too. The room had gone still in a different way now, the stillness of people watching a thing tip. Judge Pyle bent over the ledger, turning pages slow, his gray face giving nothing, and the longer he read, the more the easy confidence bled out of the three men at the other table. Coyle rose to say the book was the unproved scribbling of a deceased party, inadmissible, but Pyle held up one hand without looking up from the page, and Coyle sat back down. Because a judge reading is a judge, you do not interrupt twice. This entry. Pyle's voice was dry and carrying. He had a finger on a line, and he read it out to the room. R. Thackeray came again about the bottom. He does not know about the willows. Let him keep on thinking it a swamp. He lifted his eyes, and they went not to Adaline, but across the room to Thackeray, and there was a cold interest in them now. 11 years back. So you've wanted this particular 40 acres a good long while, Rufus. Long before there was any note for you to buy. And a week after the girl starts turning it to account, you find the security so imperiled you can't wait out your own deadline. He let that sit in the hot room where every mortgaged man in it could hear it. That's a curious kind of urgency. Thackeray's composure cracked for the first time. He came half out of his chair, the affable mask gone entirely, and what showed underneath was the naked want Adaline had seen at her fence in the July sun, only cornered now and dangerous. That book proves nothing but that a mad old woman scribbled about her hedges. You'll take the word of a dead witch and a child over a filed note and standing law? The girl is stripping mortgaged property. That's the whole of it. The rest is sentiment. The rest, Judge Pyle said, and his dryness had gone to flint, is a 20-year record that says the thing you swore impairs. The security is the exact thing that's kept this family solvent for 2 decades, and a sworn buyer in Springfield ready to say the same. You came into my court to call cutting these trees destruction. This book calls it harvest. I am inclined to believe the book, Rufus, because the book was written down, years before there was any hearing to lie for. He closed the ledger with a soft weight and laid his hand flat upon it. I find no impairment. The girl may cut and sell her crop. The note stands to its own terms, the 31st of August, and not one day sooner. And if the arrears are met by that date, this matter is closed. If you want this land, you'll wait for the deadline like any honest creditor, and pray she comes up short. Court's done. It should have been triumph, and for the length of the judge's last word it was, the room letting out its held breath in a rustle that ran to the walls, a few of the mortgaged men along the back openly grinning at the sight of Rufus Thackeray told to wait his turn. But Adaline gathered the ledger off the table and turned to go and met Thackeray's eyes across the crowded room, and what she saw in them killed the triumph in her chest. He was not beaten. He was recalculating. A judge had shut one door, and a man like Thackeray simply began, in that same moment, to look for the window, and the look he gave her was not the look of a man who has lost. It was the look of a man reminding himself how much time was left, and how many ways there were to fail before the 31st. The reckoning of it caught her on the drive home, in the white glare of the afternoon, with the dust rising off the wheels. The judge had bought her the right to cut. He had not bought her the crop. She still had to fell, strip, bundle, and haul 200 trees worth of osier and bark to the Springfield depot before the last day of August, 3 weeks off, with two pairs of hands and a borrowed understanding of a trade she had read about in a book but never once performed. Winning the hearing had only returned her to the harder problem and returned Thackeray to watching her, and she understood with a cold clarity that a man who had waited 20 years and just been humiliated in front of the county would not sit those 3 weeks quietly by. He did not. The trouble started small, the way Thackeray's troubles did. Merritt's freight arrangement, the wagons that were to carry the bundled osier from Danforth to Springfield, fell through without warning, the teamster suddenly unwilling, no reason given past a shrug and a mumbled apology, and Adaline did not have to ask who had made the man a better offer to stay home. The hardware in Danforth that had extended Silas the credit for his knives declined, all at once and with regret, to advance so much as a spool of binding twine. A rumor went through the district that the Vaughn Willows carried the blight Whitcomb had warned of in the spring, that stock watered near them would sicken, a lie with no root that nonetheless made two neighbors who had meant to help think better of it. None of it was large enough to fight in a courtroom. All of it together was a man with money, and standing making the simple act of getting a crop to market cost more, and take longer, and lean harder on a girl, and her father who had neither money nor time to spare. He can't stop us cutting. Silas stood in the dooryard the evening the teamster's refusal came, looking out at the trees that had to become money in 20 days. So he'll make every foot of the road to Springfield uphill, and hope we run out of days before we run out of trees. And he might be right. Two of us can't cut and strip 200 trees and haul them 40 miles in 3 weeks, not alone. He turned, and the admission cost him. We're going to have to ask for help. And I don't know a soul in this county who owes us a kindness after the way most of them laughed. But the county, it turned out, had been doing its own arithmetic all summer, and the answer it had reached was not the one Thackeray was counting on. The first to come was Josiah Pruitt, the old man who had rested his horse in her shade and spoken of the dry summer of '64, and he came the morning after the teamster quit, driving a wagon of his own with two grown grandsons on the seat beside him. He climbed down stiff and slow and stood, looking at the willows a while before he said his piece. I've watched every green thing in this county die since June, he said. Everything but these. My corn's gone. My beans are gone. My grandsons are sitting idle because there's nothing left to work. Rufus Thackeray put the word around that a man shouldn't help you, and that's exactly how I knew helping you was the right thing to do. You want these trees cut and hauled, girl. You've got 3 pairs of hands that aren't doing anything else, and a wagon he doesn't own. He spat in the dust. I remember your grandmother. She was worth 10 of him, and everybody knew it, and everybody was too proud to say it while she lived. I'll not make that mistake twice. They came behind Pruitt the way water finds a crack, one wagon and then two, men whose own fields had failed and who had time on their hands and a grudge against Thackeray they had never before had cause to voice. Hetty, Marcia's nephew, came out from the bank on his half-day quietly and would not take pay. Joe Kowalski, who farmed 80 acres south of town and had never once spoken to Adaline in her life, drove up with his eldest boy and a set of stripping knives and said only that he'd heard she was short of hands, and set to work. By the second week of the cutting, there were a dozen men and more in the drowned land that was no longer drowned, felling the first-year growth, stripping the bark in long, clean sheets to dry on racks Silas built along the fence, bundling the osier tight for the wagons. The willows gave and did not diminish, throwing the promise of next year's growth even as this year's came off them. The field that the whole county had laughed at in April had become, by the middle of August, the only place in Calder County where work was being done and money was being made, and men who had come out of spite for Thackeray stayed for the plain relief of doing something that paid in a season when nothing else did. Adaline stood at the edge of it one evening as the wagons loaded for the first run to Springfield, the low sun turning the stripped bark on the racks to sheets of gold, the men calling to one another across the field in the easy voices of people who have stopped being afraid, and the weight of what her grandmother had held alone came down on her full. Prudence had done all of this by herself, in secret. For 20 years, cutting and stripping and hauling a crop she dared not let the county see, holding a siege no one knew was being fought, so that, when the day came that her granddaughter needed it, the wall would still be standing. She had never asked for the dozen wagons. She had never had them. She had held the ground alone until she could hold it no longer, and had trusted the holding to a dreamy girl who drew clouds instead of learning the herbs, and the trust had been enough. Adaline pressed her hand flat against the rough bark of the nearest willow, the first of the 200 she had shoved dead into the mud 5 months before, and she made the tree a promise she did not say aloud, that the ground it stood on would not be lost, that the 20-year siege would not fail in its final week for want of one girl's nerve. The first wagons rolled for Springfield at dawn, heavy with bundled osier and dried bark, Pruitt's grandsons and Kowalski's boy driving, going the long way round by roads Thackeray's rumors had not reached, and Adaline watched the dust of them out of sight down the section road with the deadline. 11 days off and the first real money of her life, riding away toward a buyer she had never met, and she turned back to the field where a dozen men waited to cut the rest, and she took up her grandmother's stripping knife, and she went to work.